The Samaritan Pentateuch. Samaritans separated from the Jews probably during 5th or 4th century BC after a long, bitter religious and cultural struggle. At the time of the schism, one would suspect that the Samaritans took with them the scriptures as they then existed and prepared their own revised text of the Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch is not a version in the strict sense, but rather a manuscript portion of the Hebrew text itself. It contains the 5 books of Moses and is written in an ancient style of Hebrew script. Some of the older biblical manuscripts from Qumran use this script since it was revived in the 2nd century. Let me just correct it here. Lots of typos. I'm not a good typist. In the 2nd century BC, during the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks. Textual critic Frank M. Cross, Jr. believes that the Samaritan Pentateuch probably comes from about the Maccabean period. A form of the Samaritan Pentateuch's text seems to have been known to church fathers Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome. It was not available to modern Western scholars until 1616 when Pietro della Valle discovered a manuscript of the Samaritan Pentateuch in Damascus. A great wave of excitement arose among biblical scholars. The text was regarded as superior to the Masoretic text until Wilhelm Gesenius in 1815 judged it to be practically worthless for textual criticism. More recently, the value of the Samaritan Pentateuch has been reasserted by such scholars as Agarge, Cayley, and Kenyon. No extant manuscript of the Samaritan Pentateuch has been dated before the 11th century. The Samaritan community claims that one roll was written by Abishai, the great-grandson of Moses. We'll just fix this. In the 13th year after the conquest of Canaan, but the authority is so spurious that the claim may be safely dismissed. The oldest codex of the Samaritan Pentateuch bears a note about its sale in 1149-1150, but the manuscript itself is much older. One manuscript is copied in 1204. Another dated 1211 to 1212 is now in the John Rylands Library at Manchester. Another dated c. 1232 is in the New York Public Library. There are about 6,000 deviations of the Samaritan Pentateuch from the Masoretic text. Most consider it to be trivial. In about 1900 instances, the Samaritan text agrees with the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. Some of the deviations were deliberately introduced by the Samaritans to preserve their own religious traditions and dialectic. The Masoretic text perpetuates Judean dialect and traditions. They're still fighting. Samaritan Pentateuch, it is interesting to note, is written in an older form of Hebrew script than that of the Masoretic Bible and Jewish Hebrew literature in general. Somewhere about 200 BC, this older Paleo-Hebrew script was superseded among the Jews by the Aramaic or square character. Some of the older biblical manuscripts from Qumran still show it. The Paleo-Hebrew script is of the same general style as the script found in the Moabite stone, the Siloam inscription, and the Lachish letters. But the script of the Samaritans is a rather more ornamental development of it. Paul N. says of the Samaritan Pentateuch that it is a valuable witness to the text of the Old Testament. This text contains the Pentateuch and is valuable to determine textual readings. Bruce says that the variations between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic edition, 8916, of these books are quite insignificant by comparison with the area of agreement. So, Sir Frederick Kenyon states that when the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree against the Masoretic text, they represent the original reading. But when the Septuagint and the Masoretic text are opposed, it's possible that sometimes the one may be right and sometimes the other. But in any case, the difference is one of interpretation, not of text. Despite the many variants between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, there is substantial agreement between them. as noted previously, the 6,000 variants from the Masoretic text are mostly differences in spelling and cultural word variation. 1,900 variants agree with the Septuagint. For example, in the ages given for the patriarchs in Genesis 5 and 11, some Samaritan Pentateuch variants are sectarian, such as the command to build the temple on Mount Gerizim and not at Jerusalem. That's after Exodus 20 and 17. It should be noted, however, that most manuscripts of the Samaritan Pentateuch are late 13th to 14th century, and none is before the 10th century. But the Samaritan Pentateuch still confirms the general text from which it had diverged for many hundreds of years earlier. Other witnesses to the Old Testament text. Aramaic Targums. The Targum's copies appear in written form about AD 500. The basic meaning of the word Targum is interpretation. Targums are paraphrases of the Old Testament in the Aramaic language. The origins of the Targums are explained by Geisler and Nix. There is evidence that the scribes were making oral paraphrases of the Hebrew scriptures into the Aramaic vernacular as early as the time of Ezra. These paraphrases were not strictly translations, but were actually aids in understanding the archaic language forms of the Torah. The necessity for such helps arose because Hebrew was becoming less and less familiar to the ordinary people as a spoken language. By the close of the last centuries BC, this gradual process had continued. Let me just fix had. Until almost every book of the Old Testament had its oral paraphrase or interpretation. Targum. That's the word Targum means that. During the early centuries AD, these Targums were committed to writing, and an official text came to the law since the Hebrew canon text and interpretation had become well solidified before the rabbinical scholars of Tamenia. About CAD 90, and the expulsion of the Jews from Palestine in AD 135. The earliest Targums were apparently written in Palestinian. Fix that. A lot of typos here lately. I must have been laid up at night. In Palestinian Aramaic during the 2nd century AD. However, there's evidence of Aramaic Targums from the pre-Christian period. Geisler and Nix go into more detail on some of the important Targums. During the 3rd century AD, let me just save this. During the 3rd century AD, there appeared in Babylonia an Aramaic Targum on the Torah. It has been traditionally ascribed to Onkelos. Another Babylonian Aramaic Targum accompanies the prophets, former and latter, and is known as the Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel. It dates from the 4th century AD and is freer and more paraphrastic in its rendering of the text. Both of these Targums were read in the synagogue. Because the writings were not read in the synagogues, there was no reason to have official Targums for them, although unofficial copies were used by individuals. During the middle of the 7th century AD, a Targum of the Pentateuch appeared called the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum. The Jerusalem Targum also appeared in about 700, but it has survived in fragments only. After the Jews were taken into captivity, the Chaldean language replaced Hebrew. Therefore, the Jews needed the scriptures in the spoken language. So, the chief Targums are, 1, the Targum of Onkelos, 60 BC. Some say by Onkelos, a disciple of the great Jewish scholar Hillel, contains Hebrew text of the Pentateuch. The Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel, 30 BC, maybe, contains the historical books of the prophets. Now, F.F. Bruce provides more interesting background on the Targums. The practice of accompanying the public reading of the scriptures in the synagogues by an oral paraphrase in the Aramaic vernacular grew up in the closing centuries BC. Naturally, When Hebrew was becoming less and less familiar to the ordinary people as a spoken language, it was necessary that they should be provided with an interpretation of the text of Scripture in a language which they did know, if they were to understand what was read. The official charge with giving this oral paraphrase was called a methergman, or translator or interpreter, and the paraphrase itself was called a targum. Methergman was not allowed to read his interpretation out of a roll, as the congregation might mistakenly think he was reading the original scriptures. With a view to accuracy, no doubt, it was further laid down that no more than one verse of the Pentateuch and not more than 3 verses of the prophets might be translated at one time. In due course, these targums were committed to writing. J. Anderson, in the Bible, the Word of God, states their value, saying, "The great utility of the earlier targums consists in their vindicating the genuineness of the Hebrew text by proving that it was the same at the period of the targums were made as it exists among us at the present day." Now we got the Mishnah. All these things corroborate the Bible. The Mishnah, AD 200. The Mishnah repetition, explanation, teaching was completed at about AD 200. A digest of all the oral laws from the time of Moses. It was regarded as the second law, the Torah being the first law. This work was written in Hebrew, and it covered traditions as well as explanations of the oral law. The scriptural quotations are very familiar to the Masoretic text and witness to its reliability. There you go. Gemara. The Gemara, Palestinian, AD 200, Babylonian, AD 500. The Gemara, to complete, accomplish, learn, was written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, and was basically an expanded commentary on the Mishnah. It was transmitted in 2 traditions, the Palestinian Gemara, AD 200, and the larger and more authoritative Babylonian Gemara, AD 500. These commentaries, written in Aramaic, that grew up around the Mishnah, contribute to the textual reliability of the Masoretic text. The Mishnah plus the Palestinian Gemara make up the Palestinian Talmud. The Mishnah plus the Babylonian Gemara make up the Babylonian Talmud. And then we have Midrash. Midrash, 100 BC to AD 300, and was made up of doctrinal studies of the Old Testament Hebrew text. The Midrash quotations are substantially Masoretic. The Midrash textual study, drop an L in there, textual interpretation, was actually a formal doctrine and homiletical exposition of the Hebrew scriptures written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Midrashim, plural, were collected into a body of material between 100 and 300 AD, within the 100 BC and between 100 BC and AD 300. Within the Midrash were 2 major parts: the halakha, procedure, a further explanation of the Torah only, and the Haggadah, declaration, explanation, but being commentaries on the entire Old Testament. These Midrashim differed from the Targums in that the former were actually commentaries, whereas the latter were paraphrases. The Midrashim contain some of the earliest extant synagogue homilies on the Old Testament, including such things as proverbs and parables. Other important discoveries. Nash papyri. Among the earliest Old Testament Hebrew manuscripts, there is extant 1 damaged copy of the Shema and 2 fragments of the Decalogue, Deuteronomy 5:6. The Nash papyri are dated between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. Codex Qumran. The codex is the manuscript in book form with pages, according to a colophon, or inscription at the end of the book. Codex Qumran was written in vowel pointed in AD 895 by Moses ben Asher in Tiberias in Palestine. It contains the former prophets, Joshua, Judges 1 and 2, Samuel 1 and 2, Kings, and the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. Aleppo Codex. Now, Aleppo Codex was written by Shlomo ben Baal, but according to a colophon, noted it was pointed